Hey guys, we are going to round out our discussion on Chapter 4 here with heredity and with characteristics that may be dominant or recessive. So let's start right out by addressing the term genotype. We've been talking about genes, genetics, right? The fact that genes are a sequence of nucleotides that end up coding for proteins, right? But when we use the term genotype, we're just sticking to the genes. We're not talking about the proteins at all. The actual genes that are possessed by a person, right, by an individual. And sometimes they will refer to the different types of genes, the different versions of one gene you have as alleles, all right? So it's the same gene, but there are different versions of that gene, and we refer to those as alleles, okay? An example of a gene might be a gene for eye color, but you have one version of that gene, an allele for blue eyes, versus another version of that gene that would be for brown eyes, right? So you're going to see different versions of the same gene out there, but when we say genotype, we're talking just the genes you possess. When we say the word phenotype, we're thinking, what is the expression of those genes? How is the ultimate coding of proteins and the function of those proteins, or the outward expression of those proteins, going to look, right? And that would be phenotype, okay? The expression of the genes possessed by that individual, okay? So genotype's more about what are your genes. Phenotype is more about how are the proteins produced from your genetics, giving you a certain look or a certain expression of those. It doesn't have to necessarily be obvious to the naked eye, but it could be something as simple as eye color or hair color or the color of your skin, or how tall or how short you are, okay? But it could be something, phenotype could be an expression and a behavior of a single cell. Do you have a phenotype that results from the production of more insulin? Do you have stronger bones, and that's because of a certain phenotype? That would be a phenotype, something that is an expression of those genes, okay? Now, in the end, we inherit these various traits, these different characteristics, right? The phenotype can be sometimes very obvious. We have a heredity of certain characteristics, all right? So you may have your mom has red hair and 3 of her kids have red hair. They probably inherited that particular characteristic from their mother, right? And how did they inherit that? Well, the genotype is part of that story, right? The genotype, the certain genes that code for having those pigments in your hair, were passed down to those children, and then you can see that clearly in their phenotype. So this is a transmission of genetic characteristics from parent to offspring. This is going to be determined to some extent by the genotype, but some of those characteristics may be obvious to the naked eye, like these phenotypes we're mentioning with eye color and hair color. And the different alleles, of course, would be more obvious sometimes when you see those. So let's take an example of certain allele, and that would be eye color, okay? It so happens that there are various alleles, two of those versions of the gene that codes for the pigments of the eye would code for brown eyes or blue eyes. So 2 different alleles for eye color, 2 different versions of that gene. Now, if you have 2 genes for brown eyes, 2 of that particular allele, well, it would make sense that you would have brown eyes, and that's what you'd end up with, okay? If you have 2 genes for blue eyes, well, it makes sense you would have that genotype, so you would have that phenotype as well. Your phenotype would be apparent in that you would have blue eyes. Okay? Now, what's interesting is that sometimes you'll see a pairing of the allele for brown eyes and the allele for blue eyes. So you will have inherited this particular chromosome from your father, let's say, and this particular chromosome from your mother. And these are paired up. And in this case, in this particular set of alleles, it so happens that brown eyes are a dominant allele. And when paired with blue eyes will take a back seat, and the phenotype will not be apparent. So it's kind of like the brown eye allele dominates over the blue eye allele, and you'd end up with brown eyes. All right? This is not the case with all alleles. Sometimes you'll find that one allele and another will share in their contribution to phenotype. They will share in whatever it is that they code for, whatever characteristic that we're talking about. But in the case of eye color and these particular alleles in the human, we actually have a dominant gene over another. Now, what we'd say for this person over here on the left that happens to have brown eyes, is that they are a carrier, in fact. All right? They have a dominant allele that's expressed over another, brown eyes in this case. They have a recessive allele, which is not expressed in the presence of the other. No blue pigment at all. We would say that this individual is a carrier. Why? Because they are carrying this recessive allele around with them, and it's not apparent in this case. Now, we talked about a mutation in the case of sickle cell and how that was actually a detrimental thing to have, the sickle cell gene. But it so happens that the sickle cell gene behaves in a similar way as we are talking here when it comes to eye color. If you have one gene for sickle cell, it happens to play a backseat to some degree to a normal gene for hemoglobin, right? All right, so this kind of just introduces the fact that you can be carrying genes around. Your genotype might not be apparent necessarily because some of these genes are just being carried by you, okay? We'll leave it at that, and we will move on to tissues in Chapter 5 next time, okay?